In addition to his legal endeavors, Sheehan has been vocal on the topics of UFOs and alien visitation for decades. He has provided legal counsel for Harvard University psychiatrist John Mack and served as general counsel for Stephen Greer's Disclosure Project. Currently, he represents Luis Elizondo, the former director of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Sheehan is also the founder of the New Paradigm Institute, which aims to promote the public release of government-held information on unidentified anomalous phenomena, commonly known as unidentified flying objects, or UFOs. Danny, thank you so much for being here and taking the time this afternoon to speak with me.
Terrific. It's my privilege, Clint.
It's a pleasure to have you. And for those of you, your professional accomplishments are well documented and well known. But I'm kind of interested in just getting to know Danny, the person, the human being, the man. For someone of your experience and skill set to be involved at such a high level in this conversation that's going on right now, as it picks up steam and speed. I have to ask, what was the moment that you decided to make this your fight and choose this as the path that you wanted to pursue?
Well, it was interesting, Clint, that I had been fascinated by this subject ever since I was very little, and when I realized what the stars were, that they weren't just twinkling lights up in the sky. I realized that when I was like 6 or 7 years old, that these were like suns of another solar system all throughout the universe. And that I was just completely convinced that there had to be people on the planets that were going around them. And so from the very beginning, I was originally planning to be an astronomer. And then I realized that it was much more interesting being an astronaut. And so I was going to be an astronaut. And I applied to the United States Air Force Academy coming out of high school. I was the #1 candidate out of New York State to get the senatorial appointment to the Air Force Academy so I could go there and become an astronaut. And when Jacob Javits, the United States Senator, was interviewing me for the senatorial appointment, he asked me why I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. And I told him that I wanted to become an astronaut. And he said, oh, yes, 1963, all young men want to become an astronaut. He says, well, why do you want to become an astronaut? And I said, because well, I said, look, we're right at this extraordinary point in our human family where we're going to be going out into the stars and meeting these other people from these other civilizations. And he said, you actually believe that there's other people on other planets? And I said, absolutely. I said, you're a United States Senator. I said, you must realize that too. And he was kind of flabbergasted and actually went to the point of admitting to me that he had already given the appointment to the son of one of his major financial supporters. And he said, that's the way the real world is, but I'll give you the appointment to the Naval Academy. And I said, no, I'm not into boats. I'm into planes. And he said, no, you can fly in the Navy and you get to be an astronaut. I said, no, I said, I don't want to spend, the whole 4 years at the Academy worrying about boats and ships. I said, I want to go to the Air Force Academy. So he said, okay, you can get the congressional appointment from your regular congressman. You don't have to have the senatorial appointment. And he said, so I'll just get a hold of your congressman and get him to give you the appointment. Well, the congressman gave the appointment to the son of the mayor of Glens Falls, where I was born. The Republican's mayor. And so I ended up going to Harvard College instead and studying foreign policy under Henry Kissinger and sociology under David Reisman and economics under John Kenneth Galbraith and all of that stuff. And then was the Rhodes Scholar nominee from Harvard College. But my draft board refused to let me go because I was 1A. And so I said, I'm not going to go do that. I mean, that whole war is completely illegal. And I'm going to go to Harvard Law School. So I went to Harvard Law School and co-founded the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review. And started working from that point on. I had come to realize that the way Jacob Javits had conducted himself and the appointments and everything, that somehow the whole constitutional system that we were working with in our democracy was a little bit out of tune. And I would have to kind of become a lawyer to figure out how to help get this back in tune. And then I could get back on to my task of getting ready to become an astronaut. And I realized after a few years out in practice, I realized that our system wasn't just a little bit out of tune. It was playing an entirely different song than we'd been taught in high school civics and even at Harvard College in government studies. So I had to become more and more deeply involved. And so I was looking to find the right client to represent. And I went to the #1 corporate litigation law firm in the world, representing the New York Times. And that's where we did the Pentagon Papers case. And I initiated the case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. So I developed a lot of really good friends in the investigative journalist community. I started finding out more and more things, including the Pentagon Papers. And so we ended up representing the New York Times and getting the Pentagon Papers published. And I then went on to the #1 criminal defense firm in the country of F. Lee Bailey. And we represented James McCord in the Watergate burglary. And James McCord is the former CIA wiretapping specialist that was in the headquarters with the other burglars. And he's the one we got to actually blow the whistle on Richard Nixon and the White House plumbers unit. And I realized that neither one of those places, the major corporate firm or criminal defense firm, is where I really wanted to be. And so I ended up going back to Harvard to talk with the head, John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy. And he had me come back to Harvard to do a master's work and then a PhD in comparative social ethics, comparing and contrasting how all these different worldviews were functioning at the same time. And so I ended up doing that, and I got recruited out of the Harvard Divinity School to become general counsel for the United States Jesuit headquarters in their social ministry office, dealing with public policy. And that's where, so I spent 20 years in Washington doing that. And we set up the Christic Institute to do litigation, to actually conduct professional investigations of major public policy challenges. And I was there at the Jesuit headquarters when I got contacted in 1977, early in 77, right after President Carter was elected in November of 76. And I got contacted by the director of the Congressional Research Service in the Science and Technology Division, Dr. Marcia Smith, who told me that President Carter had tasked the Congressional Research Service with doing a major investigation and study about the UFO phenomenon, because he had actually seen a UFO. And he had, as soon as he was elected on November 2nd of 1976. And on the 19th of November, he invited George Bush Sr., who was the director of the CIA at that time, previously appointed by President Ford, who took Richard Nixon's place when he resigned. So Bush refused to give him the information, said that he had no need to know, and he wasn't going to brief him on this. And so President Carter asked to have these studies done by the Congressional Research Service. And I was contacted by Dr. Marcia Smith and asked to become special counsel to that investigation. You might say, well, why did she contact you to do that? It was a much more narrow point. She wanted to see if I, as legal counsel at the Jesuit headquarters, could get at the Vatican archives to see if we could get access to the information that the Vatican had on the UFO phenomenon, in the existence of extraterrestrial life. And so I agreed to do that. And I got permission from the provincials here in the United States to do that. And but the archives would not give us that information. So I continued working on this. We went to the heads of all 54 of the major religious denominations out of the Jesuit headquarters and asked them to put together a task force to start getting out ahead of this issue so that we could start adjusting, might I say, elevating the kind of level of consciousness of the major religious traditions to try to cope with and integrate this larger reality. And so I was engaged in that process, and I was contacted by Dr. John Mack at Harvard, who had written a book about this, because as it turns out, the United States Air Force and the military and the Defense Department, along with the CIA, had this project underway where they were not only recovering crashed UFOs and trying to back engineer them, but they had this covert program underway trying to destroy the reputation of anybody who tried to investigate the UFO phenomenon. And anybody who tried to talk about their having seen a UFO, they would come and visit them and threaten them to keep them silent. I was offended by that. So when Dr. Mack, one of the first things that they would do in the Defense Department, if any high-level military official kept insisting upon getting briefed in on the UFO program, they would immediately order him to go get a psychiatric exam. It was part of the way they were trying to deter anybody from doing it. And so a number of these high-level military officials have been sent to Harvard Medical School to get the psychiatric exam. And it was Dr. John Mack that actually was the head of the department who administered those tests. And he became puzzled after a half a dozen of these guys saying, look, this is something very weird is going on here, because these guys test out as being very much within the normal parameters of psychiatric normalcy, that they're all having this experience of having seen the UFOs. They're extraordinarily interested and concerned about this, and they keep pressing it inside their military services, and they've been forced to come and get this psychiatric exam. So he decided he was going to write an article about this for the New England Journal of Medicine, actually, and he submitted the article, and they refused to publish it. So he said, oh, I'm going to sit down and rework this article and put in a lot more footnotes, make it very scholarly. And he'd already won the Pulitzer Prize for literature. He did the definitive psychobiography of T.E. Lawrence and won the Pulitzer Prize for us. So he said, I know how to do a scientific study. So he sent it back to them, and they sent it back to him, the executive assistant to the board of editor, the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, sent the package back unopened. said wanted to make sure that his executive assistant told Dr. Mack that they hadn't even opened it. They weren't even going to look at it. They weren't even going to consider publishing it. And he was so upset that he published it as a book and got dragged up in front of the faculty at Harvard to challenging his tenure for undermining the public reputation of Harvard for even looking at a thing like that. So he contacted me and asked me to, since I'd been to the college and the law school and the divinity school, to come in and represent him in front of this faculty committee. And so that was really the crossover point where I started getting introduced to all kinds of people to be witnesses, to actually present them at the Harvard University as sort of a grand rounds on this question of UFOs and extraterrestrial life. And so I got to meet Bud Hopkins. I got to meet Stanton Friedman. I got to meet all of the major people, Colonel Wendell Stevens. I got to meet all of the major people, David Jacobs and everybody. And so I also then, when we won that and got Harvard to drop it, because I informed them that we were lining up major witnesses to present to them on this question. I confronted the committee. I said, look, whatever the nature of this committee is that you've gathered here, this faculty committee, are either one of the two following fact questions going to be at issue? Number one, whether an extraterrestrial civilization exists. And secondly, whether the UFO phenomenon, at least one or more of these sightings, was actually a vehicle from an extraterrestrial civilization. And Arthur Relman, who was chairing the faculty committee, who by the way was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, who had refused to publish his article to begin with, when I said, are either of these two fact questions going to be at issue? And he said, well, absolutely, they're going to be at issue. And it's totally ridiculous to think that either one of those things is true. And so that was sort of the status of that Harvard University. It's sort of the seat of the liberal ethic in Western civilization, at least in their own mind, was actually willing to take the position that, it was ridiculous to think that UFOs were real and that they came from an extraterrestrial civilization. So I informed them that John Mack and I had been to see Lawrence Rockefeller and Lawrence Rockefeller had agreed to finance a complete grand rounds at Harvard University on this issue. And so I got to spend the time preparing that grand rounds. We got to meet almost all the major players anywhere in the world to bring on as witnesses. And so when we ended up winning that, John Mack had me become general counsel for his project for extraordinary experience research. And I got to meet all kinds of experiencers, all kinds of people who were completely convinced that they had had a direct face-to-face encounter with extraterrestrial beings. They had seen ships land and people get off and talk with them. So I became engulfed in this particular issue, and because of that, I was contacted in 2001 by Dr. Stephen Greer, and he asked me to be legal counsel for the Disclosure Project. In May of 2001, we brought together 24 government officials and employees who had had direct knowledge about these programs and brought them to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and presented them under oath to the staff of Congress. But at that time, none of the congressmen would come. They didn't dare, because they thought that they would be attacked, by this covert program that the CIA and the Defense Department, some mysterious unit inside the Defense Department, had going, destroying the political careers and legal careers and professional careers of anybody who tried to challenge them. So I was legal counsel for the Disclosure Project for 20 full years, and got to, again, meet almost all the people, Travis Walton and all of the Andreessen family, the other people that are famous people who've been involved in this program. And I got to meet them all in the context of being the lawyer for this whole movement. And so that's how I became involved in this. And then Lou Elizondo, who you mentioned at the top of the meeting here, he was the head of the top secret program inside the Pentagon, actually continuing to investigate the UFO phenomenon. And he, as you know, and all your listeners probably know, he became totally frustrated over the fact that he was being shut out. And he knew that there was some group deep in the Defense Department and the intelligence community that was controlling this. And they were shutting him out from getting the information. And Congress had already appropriated like $22 million for his program to dig out this information. And he was being blocked from getting at it. So he wrote a letter to Secretary of Defense Mattis and complained about it. And his letter got impounded. They wouldn't give it to him. And so he resigned in protest. And he brought with him these three now quite famous videos, the F-18 Super Hornet videos, and brought them to the New York Times, along with Christopher Mellon, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence under both President Clinton and under George W. Bush. The two of them brought this information to the New York Times, and very importantly, the board of editors of the New York Times found it to be so completely convincing that they published it, and they released these videos, and that began sort of the more recent era of this entire UFO phenomenon, and it's resulted in us getting the complaint that we filed immediately after that, because the Defense Department tried to retaliate against both Lou and against Chris Mellon and challenge their security clearances. And so I was representing Lou, and we filed a complaint with the Defense Department's Inspector General, complaining about what they were doing, and also complaining about the fact that there was this illegal program going on that was completely unconstitutional. That they had this secret program going on, and they were not only not briefing Congress in on it, but they were lying. They were actively lying to Congress, committing perjury to Congress. They were lying to presidents and concealing this information. Like, who did they think they were? To deny the information to the president and to the Secretary of Defense and to the Congress, that they actually had begun to suspect that they were the government instead of the government of the United States. Now, we encountered that same kind of problem in the Iran-Contra case, as you remember, where this deep covert operation inside the Central Intelligence Agency, its operations directorate, began to believe they were the government of the United States and they could defy Congress. They could refuse to brief in presidents about what they were doing. And our office, initiated the federal criminal racketeering charges against them and got the special prosecutor appointed, Lawrence Walsh, and generated major congressional hearings to expose what was going on. So that's obviously one of the reasons, I think, why Lou Elizondo contacted me to ask me to become his lawyer. And so we crafted a complaint with the Inspector General that was a lot broader than just a simple whistleblower complaint. What we were saying is that this entire program was illegal and unconstitutional, and that they had to promulgate a certain number of protocols to protect people inside the military services and intelligence community that could bring forth this information to Congress and not get retaliated against. And so the broad complaint that Lou Elizondo filed started to generate a whole lot of activity inside the Defense Department and the intelligence community. And then Lou and Chris Melland and others began to come forward to the Senate Intelligence Committee, saying, look, you guys know that you're being excluded from this information. You have a constitutional obligation to get this information in order to help formulate the policies for our government. We can't have some super secret clandestine group deep inside the Defense Department somewhere, making these decisions. The whole government of our United States needs to make this decision, and the people need to know about this. So that is what has generated the putting together of the initial statute that we got passed back in 2022 that protected the whistleblowers on this issue and set up an office called the AARO office, the All Domain Anomalous Resolution Office. It was a place where the people could come and bring the information, still under top secret classification, but to bring it to them so that they could end up briefing Congress. The problem was that office, the AARO office, was still under the auspices of the Defense Department and the intelligence community. They're the ones that have been concealing the information for 75 years.
The wolves are guarding the hen house in this case.
Yeah. So the whistleblowers didn't trust them. And so they didn't go to them. What they did is they continued coming to the Senate Intelligence Committee, where primarily Senator Rubio, who was Lou Elizondo's senator from Florida, was actually leaning in on trying to get something done about this. And so we all worked together to craft a new statute that actually would get Senator Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate, to sponsor this, along with one of the most conservative senators, from South Dakota, the reddest of the red states. They co-joined together. You had Marco Rubio, and you had Senator Christian Gillibrand from New York. You had people over on the House side that were all supportive of this 64-page piece of legislation, basically the UFO Controlled Disclosure Act. And that's what we people put together that thing. I wasn't directly involved in the drafting, but I was talking to the people that were, and that got put together and proposed, and it was passed by the Senate Intelligence Committee by 17-0. I mean, it was an absolutely completely bipartisan support for it. It had every single one of the Republican senators, every single one of the Democratic senators voted for it. It passed the United States Senate unanimously, and it was sent over to the House to try to set up an independent board to demand that all this information be turned over to the board and that they then review it and decide what information ought to be released to the public and what information needed to be postponed. But they wanted to then set up, pursuant to that bill, a UFO controlled disclosure campaign that would take over like a 7-year period in which they would roll out the information to the people of the United States, to Congress, and to the world, what they had now discovered. And so that piece of legislation was put out and passed by the Senate the day after Colonel David Grush testified over in the House side to the House Oversight Committee, testifying under oath that that we were in possession of an intact extraterrestrial non-human spacecraft, along with biological evidence of the species that was operating the UFOs. And he testified to that on July 26th of 2023. And the Senate passed this bill the very next day on the 27th, saying we had to go and reveal this. In the House, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Michael Turner, his name was, he stuck his thumb right in everybody's eye and said, no, we're not going to let this get passed. And it turns out he comes from the 10th Congressional District in Ohio, which is the home of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And it's also the principal field office for Radiance Technology, which is one of the aerospace industry that's trying to back engineer the technology from the UFOs to make a super weapon, a missile system that can deliver a first strike attack against Russia or China from launch within 2 minutes.
Is this the excuse me, the prompt global strike?
Yeah, prompt global strike.
Yeah.
It was the code name for the program, so they were in the process of trying to commandeer and keep secret the fact that they had this UFO in possession, and they were going to back engineer the technology just to make a super weapon.
So has that if I may interrupt, has that been officially established that Radiance actually is in possession of material, or is that still kind of murky?
Well, I mean, that they haven't admitted it publicly, but on the other hand, nobody admitted anything in public until Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon came forward, and then David Grush and others. We've now got 40 people who have come forward to the Senate Intelligence Committee and are providing detailed evidence along with documentation to prove the program. And the reality is that Radiance Technology had been involved over a period of time with Lockheed Martin, trying to get an agreement where they could get possession of the same technology that Lockheed Martin had been given. And so that these two major aerospace corporations, we know, are engaged in that process, and we know that it's called prompt global strike. That's what the program is.
Sounds so convenient. When you want to launch a global strike, you want it to be prompt as can be, right?
Yeah. Well, the problem is if it gets too prompt, then nobody can defend against it, and you totally destroy the entire geopolitical structure that we put in place for warning each other and making sure that no mistakes are made and that nobody thinks that somebody's going to attack them, so rapidly that they can't defend themselves.